One of them is that I said projects that join two agencies together that don't normally work together. So I'll give two examples of what that means. And the idea here is that some of the most difficult problems that you talk about here often don't neatly line up to how the government organizes itself. Like, you gotta have people from multiple agencies all working together on the same issue. So one is trying to have a partnership between NPD and our Department of Behavioral Health that does substance abuse treatment, mental health treatment, in which they'll do joint responses to areas where there's either not a crime, but there's a complaint, or there's a very low level or nonviolent criminal offense. And the underlying cause is either a drug addiction or mental health crisis. And it is technically an arrestable offense, but one in which there's not, there's not a meaningful outcome if you put someone through the criminal justice process. Other cities have done this, and they found that there's a pretty dramatic reduction in arrests for what is inherently often a substance or mental health crisis, and a big increase in people getting treatment when it's done well. And so we're putting about $1 million to launch that program here in DC next year. Second example, trying to be innovative to tackle problems, is that in DC we have just about the highest rate of people calling 911 for medical emergencies anywhere in the country. We often will have almost double the rate per person as a lot of other cities. And many of these are not medical emergencies. They're individuals who might not have good access or know how to access another kind of doctor than an ER, and often it's a medical issue in which they going to the ER won't get to the root cause. So we have a proposal in 18 to have nurses be at the 911 center. So this will be the first time ever, at least in DC, where when you call 911, there's an option besides a firefighter, EMT, or a cop. And it's aimed at folks who are calling 911 but don't really need to go to the ER. And they can if they want to, but we're gonna have a nurse there to be able to, for those really low-level calls, low-level in the sense that they're not appropriate for ER, a nurse will talk to them, do an over-the-phone assessment, and then set up an appointment at an urgent care clinic or a community center, and then if they're Medicaid eligible, try to provide transportation. Now, someone still needs to go to the ER, they will and can, but it's trying to provide an outlet by thinking a little bit outside of the box about how to connect to people who are calling 911 and are consuming a lot of the capacity that we have in our ambulances and taking up doctor time at the ER for something that maybe a primary care physician should do. And the third thing, and I think I'm running well over my 5 minutes, apologize, is the third theme I mentioned was violent crime. So you heard from the police officers here, and the police do a really good job being present, being proactive in a positive way. But often police are called after the crime has happened, so the violence is around violence prevention. So the mayor's standing up a Office of Violence Prevention, that if Councilmember McDuffie were here, that we've worked together over the past few months to sort of forge out a vision for what that should look like. And at its heart, it's about trying to have individuals who know how to identify and connect with individuals who are really at risk of either becoming victims or victimizing others. And outside of and not interfering with the police process, try to connect them to things that the city, as a city, we already fund and pay for, and services that might divert them and prevent the violence. And so at its heart, it's supposed to have a public health companion, trying to look at what individuals are spawning and spreading violence, and are there things that we can do before things reach the point of violence to more effectively intervene. So we're going to start an office in 2018 around that. So that sort of is a focus on violence prevention that I want to highlight. So these are things that might strike you as being interesting, you support, or things that you think make no sense. And so the reason I'm really here is to try to use that little speech as a way to encourage you to learn more and get involved. How your city prioritizes things, as you can say, in a sense, you can point to a budget and say how a country, state, or city spends its money often reflects what, at the end of the day, it's valuing and focusing on. There's a really good website that doesn't get enough traffic called openbudget.dc.gov. That's openbudget, all one word, .dc.gov. It's a very, I use it myself. It's a very visually interactive site where you can look at by agency, sometimes by ward, by policy area, what the city is spending on, how that compares to prior years. And it lets you, I think, have a more accessible way than looking at a dense, highly formatted budget book. And so I would encourage you to go to that and find things that either you like or some things that strike you as you want to advocate because it doesn't make any sense to you. And then with that, if this was before mid-March, I would say, there are ways to communicate to the budget team, to myself and the mayor's office. Now the budget's with council, so there's still opportunities to get involved. The city council votes on the budget at the end of this month. I know just from today there was a number of people walking through, both advocates, but a lot of just private citizens walking through city council, emailing folks and trying to voice an opinion about the budget. And I would encourage you to take what's left in the window to stay involved and express your views. Thank you for giving me much more than 5 minutes.
Take questions
and I'll take questions. What I'll say is that there's some parts of the budget I know a lot about, and there's some parts I don't. What I'll commit to you, if you ask me a question I don't know the answer to, I will get you the answer. It just may be making a phone call later tonight or tomorrow morning, but I'll make sure you get the answer. And I have the sun in my eyes, so I'm not going to step. Yes?
You mentioned that DC Fire and EMS being called for ambulance. A lot of people are using the system just to get help, get seen by a doctor. What about the ones that are the drug addicts, the ODs and so forth?
Yeah. So the overdoses, if someone is really overdosing, then we will take that's absolutely needs to go to an ER. For individuals who in which there's an addiction issue that's not an emergency room, it's not a purpose for emergency room. Both the joint response with MPD and the nurse triage line can help with that. It can, particularly if someone's calling who's not the person who's on drugs, they're calling about someone they see. The increase in synthetic drugs, which picked up 2 years ago, had a really profound impact on our ambulances in the city. It tends to come in waves, and perhaps a lot of this is factory-made drugs, so you never know what's in it. We'll have days, and these are the worst days, typically in the summer, where a quarter of the entire ambulance fleet, if we're having a mass overdose, which we do maybe 3 or 4 times a year, a quarter of our fleet will get tied up with one location. We may have 10, 12, or 15 individuals, and it's a real problem. We have tried to take the DC-owned ambulances and devote them exclusively for the most critical emergencies, which are called advanced life support emergencies. And then part of when we expanded our ambulance space, part of that is a private ambulance service that the city directs and contracts with. That was done in part to help handle some of the non-emergency calls that were taking up the time of paramedics who need to be doing medicine with someone else. So it continues to be a problem that not just DC, a lot of cities are trying to get their full hands around. I don't know if that answered your question. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned staffing levels and part of the budget going toward policemen, paramedics, etc., as well as your recruitment plan to kind of bridge the capability gap that currently exists in the police force. A few months ago, there were some reports about the number of policemen in the DC area earning, six-figure salaries because of the overtime issue. And so you talked about, you know, kind of the pendulum swinging back to filling that staffing gap. Is the 2 years you talked about, the plan of action to reduce maybe the need for the overtime, portion of the police force? And then in addition, are you able to provide, a percentage of the current allocated budget that would be going toward that overpay as opposed to base salary?
That's a really good question. So I'm going to take them. They're related. I'll give you my best answer. So she's pointing out a really important phenomenon, which is when the police department's under-resourced with officers, how do they make up for that to maintain their patrol levels? Well, it's through overtime. Sometimes it's overtime of officers who know the neighborhoods. When the police department gets really tight for staffing, they'll pull officers who aren't normally assigned to a PSA to do overtime. And then you have an officer who's doing patrol work and doing everything they can as a cop, but they won't know the people, they won't know the streets as well, because they're getting pulled from a different PSA. So part of what we're trying to do to increase recruitment and reduce people leaving is to reduce that structural overtime. So now there's not overtime based on an incident, it's overtime based on the fact that we need to recruit more heavily and we need to stop folks from leaving. So when you see large salaries, you're right, a large part, that's not their base pay, it's going to be overtime. The impact it has as sort of for the police chief standpoint is that one, it can take officers who aren't assigned to a district or PSA and moves them into a neighborhood they're not as familiar with, but also can lead to just exhaustion, where folks are being held over shifts that, and we want the police officers to stay fresh. So I can't give you an exact percentage of what's going to go to reducing the overtime need and what's going to go to just greater staffing, but it is a mix of both, and it's something that, like, I actively talk with both the CFO, the police chief, and the mayor about one of the policy goals that we talked about when we were thinking about this was the fact that that we were concerned, particularly in the summer, that a level of exhaustion would set in. A little fact that I learned about a year ago is every Memorial Day, there's so many events that happen in the city. Something when people don't realize it's not just police in the city, is there's a lot of things related to the fact that we're the nation's capital. So on Memorial Day weekend of last year, 1,800 police officers spent at least 1 hour working an event of some kind. And that gives you a sense that the overtime is to both have a heavier patrol presence, but there's things that as a city we have to do to keep events safe that also takes a toll as well. So that's where getting DDOT to help with some of those functions, but there's also that toll of just being the nation's capital. So that's my best at answering this for you right now. Yes.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. I mean, that was just really comprehensive, excellent. I love the work that you're doing, the team. I think we're moving in the right direction with regard for not just public safety for my area, but public safety in general for the city. I appreciate the chief vetting process that your office established. I certainly support Chief Bishop. I think he's the right person for the right job. You know, the mayor has introduced an ambitious budget that I can really support, and I had the pleasure of participating in one of the budget workshops. So I think these are good days ahead for the city, and especially regarding public safety. I want to ask you a question about, you spoke about increasing monies for officers to live in the city. Is that going to be added to EHAP, you know, the Employee Assistance Program, or is that a separate program?
So,
and I have another question.
Good question. So, there's two incentives to live in the city. They're both housing related, because housing is the drive. The housing is what often has folks leave elsewhere. One is, the program I talked about is called EHAP. So it's adding $1 million to EHAP that's focused on police, but also firefighters and teachers. And the second one is when an officer first joins, I'm going to